Because if you miss this step, what could happen is you might end up building your business around that name. You're going to put in time, money, effort, blood, sweat, tears, everything into building this business under that name. And then because you're awesome, it's going to be successful. And once it's successful, you might get a dreaded cease and desist letter from someone who says, hey, I have a trademark right in that name. You can't use it.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry, but you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klinck.
Hey there. Welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klinck, and I'm excited for today's episode because we're continuing our series of mini trainings where I'm really walking you through legal concepts you need to know as an online entrepreneur in more depth. We started a couple episodes ago with kind of a legal checklist, and then the last episode was all about structuring your business, the basic concepts, and we're going to continue today in this series. So it's a bit different than our normal format where I'm interviewing someone and giving a quick legal lesson. Instead, I'm doing this series where we're going in depth with mini trainings to really help you get the basics and get a really good grounding and footing in these issues. So I hope you're enjoying it. If you are, I'd love for you to shoot me an email, bobby@youronlinegenius.com. Also subscribe to the podcast if you're enjoying it because I don't want you to miss anything. Now, this week, we're going to continue with kind of what is a crucial first step in your business. Now, you've probably already taken it, and so you may have to kind of step back if you haven't done that. And today, we're talking about naming your business. And it applies to naming your business, but it also applies to naming if you have a signature product, if you have a podcast, if you have anything like that. All of the concepts we're going to talk about today are going to apply to that area as well. And this is obviously an important issue, and you need to address it. And what it has to do with is an area of law known as trademark law. So trademark law is basically all about branding. But before I get into the mini training, I want you to think about what process you went through to come up with a name for your business, your product, especially if you're using a personal brand for your business. Think about it for a product. Now, the typical process works something like this. Most entrepreneurs will do something where they kind of brainstorm and then maybe they spitball with some of their good friends and come up with one idea or multiple ideas, and then they're trying to figure out which one to use. And then they probably go into a Facebook group with hopefully their ideal customer avatar, but someone at least within that area. And then they're going to do a poll and get their thoughts. And then maybe they get some suggestions. And then they find something they're like, yeah, this is perfect. I've done it with webinars. I've done it with a lot of different things, but that's kind of the process. But most entrepreneurs stop there. They don't go with the next step, which is to make sure that you can legally use that name. And if you miss this step, you're asking for trouble. Because if you miss this step, what could happen is you might end up building your business around that name. You're going to put in time, money, effort, blood, sweat, tears, everything into building this business under that name. And then because you're awesome, it's going to be successful. And once it's successful, you might get a dreaded cease and desist letter from someone who says, hey, I have a trademark right in that name. You can't use it. And at that point, your heart is going to sink and you're going to be sitting there saying, oh, wow, what did I do? And so you don't want to find yourself in those shoes. Instead, you want to do the work up front, or if you've already chosen a name, you want to do it now and make sure that there's not an issue so that you can kind of pivot now if you need to, rather than waiting till it's a crisis. So let's dive in. I'm going to walk you through some key concepts here. First, we're going to go through kind of a basic legal lesson about trademark law, so you'll understand the basic concept. Then I'm going to talk about where you have some common areas of concern. After that, we're going to talk about, okay, what do you need to do to avoid a problem? And this is kind of the defense first of make sure that you're not going to get into real trouble. And then finally, we're going to talk about kind of the proactive side of what do you want to do or what should you do to protect your name once you've chosen it. So those are the 4 big areas we're going to talk about. Let's go ahead and start and dive in with the legal lesson of trademark law. So the key concept here to understand about trademark is that trademark law is all about branding. The point of it is to protect a word, a phrase, a symbol, a product shape, a logo, anything like that, that is kind of that comes to identify who produced or is selling a product or service. So think about it. I always like to use Nike as an example when I'm using this. The word Nike is the name. It's a word mark that is trademark. You obviously know, hey, if I see the word Nike on something, it means it comes from this company known as Nike. But then you also have the swoosh, so you know their logo immediately when you see it. And then you have just do it, which is a phrase that, again, if you saw that on a t-shirt, for example, you would immediately know, that is a Nike product because you know that phrase is associated with Nike. So that's the concept of trademark law in a very nutshell. It's basically so that you as someone who's in commerce, who is selling things, can create something so that consumers can kind of immediately understand who is creating the product, who the product is coming from, et cetera. So that's the idea behind it. And that's, the idea. The idea is to make life easier on consumers so they can quickly know basically who's selling them this product, because you start to make judgments about the value of a product based upon who produces it. Again, I could go back to Nike. Maybe you like them, maybe you don't like them, but you have an opinion about the quality of Nike's products. And so because of that, you are able to kind of short circuit your decision making when you see, this product's from Nike. Do I like them or not? Yes or no. And in your mind, you can do that immediately without having to do as much digging or research, for example, that you might have to do if we didn't have trademark law. Like, think if you didn't have brands, how would you evaluate a product? You'd have to evaluate every single product in so much depth that would be really hard to do. So what will generally happen is once someone has trademark rights in a name, a logo, a slogan, anything like that, that trademark holder, the person who owns those rights, can prevent anyone else from using the same mark, so the same word, the same phrase, the same logo, or a similar mark. So it doesn't even have to be identical. If it would likely confuse consumers about who the source of the goods or products are. So the idea is you can't use an identical mark, but you also can't use a similar one. For that, I like to use the example of a story I like to tell. When I was in high school, I was a part of this competition team that my high school had that had a long tradition where it was a legal competition, which is kind of strange, but we came up to Washington, D.C. from Texas as part of it because we'd won our state competition. And we had a day on the National Mall and a bunch of the other kids came back. So we all went our own way and I don't remember what we all did, but then we all come back together and all these people are like, oh man, I was able to buy these Oakleys for $10 off this guy. When you look closely, it wasn't Oakley, it said Oakley. So they were clearly using the word Oakley to try to confuse people so that they would think they were getting Oakley products. Now, again, that was a case, obviously, of a very intentional attempt to confuse people, but it could happen even if you don't do it intentionally. So the analysis of the question of whether you can use a name legally if someone else has a trademark is always going to come down to, would it confuse the consumers if you used your name? So it's going to involve looking at a couple of different places. You're going to have to look at, number one, how similar is the name to whatever someone has a right in? And then also, are you in the same area or a related area of commerce? In this example I like to use, look, if you're an online course creator and you happen to have the same name as a local coffee shop, well, someone's not going to be confused and think that you're the same business. But let me give you another example. Let's say you are a social media ad management company, so a Facebook ad management company, and you want to use a name that someone in SEO is using. Well, that's pretty close. So you could see someone might think that, well, hey, if this company offers SEO services, they probably also offer Facebook ad management. So that becomes a closer question. Now, so that's kind of in a nutshell what trademark rights are, and what it will do is allow you to prevent someone from using a similar mark, or it could prevent you from using a name if it's similar to someone else's. But another question is, how do you get trademark rights? And trademark rights come from two places. There are what are called common law rights, and common law is a word for basically saying kind of automatic, or it just kind of springs out of nowhere. When you hear that generally from a lawyer, if they talk about the common law or common law something, it means there's not anything formal. It just comes about. Well, under the law, you get rights to any name that you start using commercially automatically, and as soon as you start using it. Those rights are kind of limited. You get protection where you are, where you're selling, where you're actively doing commerce, et cetera. So there's some limits. Then there's a separate area where you might get trademark rights, and that is if you register a trademark. And here in the United States, you do that at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And when you register a mark, you could either register it by saying, hey, I'm already using it commercially, or you could say, I intend to use it commercially in the future. And you could get a trademark even if you're not yet using it. So that's another way you can get rights. The advantage if you file to register a mark is you will get protection nationwide across the entire United States. There are also some advantages if you ever had to enforce it. And also if it, once you've had a trademark for say 5 years, I think it's 5 years, people can't challenge it. So you kind of have presumed rights and it becomes incontestable. So there are some benefits to filing it. Now, because there are different ways that you could get protection, there are some pros and cons to that, right? The automatic protection is great because you, as a business owner, as soon as you start using a name, you're getting protection. You're building up rights. The downside is there's not one central repository, one central place where you can go to see if someone else already has rights in it. So we're going to get to that when we get to the kind of the guidance section of what you have to do, which you have to search multiple places because there's not just one way to get these rights. So that's kind of the pros and cons of that. Again, I talked about there are some definite advantages of filing to register your trademark with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And it's a pretty simple process. The fees, I think it's you pay something like $225 to the government. But what I'm going to tell you is if you're going to go that route, you definitely need to hire a lawyer. I'm a big proponent of do it yourself in a lot of things. I would not even try to file a trademark application myself. And I'm an IP lawyer because I don't do it day in and day out. It's one of those things where you want to make sure that whoever's doing it, this is kind of what they do all day, every day, because that will ensure that they know the process, because it's kind of one of those in the weeds process types of things that you need someone who knows what they're doing. So you can find people pretty inexpensively if it's a simple process and there are no issues. So, but it's a simple process. It can get done. It takes a while though. It'll take you multiple months. I think when I got my trademark for Your Online Genius, it took something like 9 months before it finally issued. So it's not something that happens overnight, but you can do it and it's not an expensive process. Now, another issue I want to address kind of in this legal issue is a lot of people ask or have questions about the notice and the symbols and all that. You do not have to give notice to people that you have a trademark, whether it's registered or not. Now, there can be advantages if someone later starts using your mark. They can't claim that they were an innocent infringer if you have put notice and they, for example, saw your name with one of those nice little symbols on it. They can't claim, well, I didn't know. But even that is not a huge thing. Again, candidly, I'm not using any of the symbols or notices. A lot of IP lawyers will say, oh, you definitely have to do it. Personally, to me, the aesthetic's important, and so I don't really want to put it there. I may change that in the future. It is what it is. But there's two different marks you might use. One is a TM, or you might use SM. That is if you have not registered your mark. So if you haven't gone through the process of getting a registered mark from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, that's what you can use. A TM is a trademark. You might see SM for service mark, because when you're offering a service rather than a product, technically you would get a service mark, not a trademark. It's the same process, but that issue. So if you see someone who's put a TM on something, what they're saying is, we believe we have trademark rights, but we haven't yet gotten a trademark on it, or a registered trademark. Once you have a registered mark, that's when you have that R with the circle around it, which is normally a superscript. So you'll see that is the mark of a registered trademark. You are not allowed to use that until your trademark has issued as a registered mark from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So don't start using it because you file or anything else. You have to wait until it issues if you're going to do that. So that's marks in a nutshell. There can be advantages, but again, that's a decision you have to make from your perspective of whether it's worth doing. So in a nutshell, what we talked about. So let's recap quickly what the legal lesson is. Trademark law gives essentially the first person who starts using a brand name in commerce, which means basically commercial, for a commercial purpose, the exclusive right to use that name for, that or related areas of trade. So you can't use a name if someone else is already using it. I like to quote my favorite fictional race car driver here: if you're not first, you're last. The wonderful Ricky Bobby taught us that in that movie. Now, the concept of that is you've got to be the first one to use it. If someone else is using it, you probably cannot use the name. So that's the central concept here that you need to understand for trademark law. So with that in mind, I want to transition and pivot then to what are the common areas of concern where this can come up, where you need to be especially vigilant about this, and people don't think about it. A couple of things. One, if you have a name, a slogan, or something that is kind of a mashup of words or uses a part of a word and combines it with something else, then you need to be cautious. And I raise this because I know you, as my listeners, most of you are in the online entrepreneurship space. Words that end with preneur are often trademarked. There are some, I think fempreneur, for example, is trademarked. There are some of those things where people have taken, the beginning of one word and preneur and added it to it, that they have gone through the process of getting a registered trademark. It's not unique to preneur. Any place where you have something like that, where in a certain niche, you've got people who are doing these shortenings of, something and combining a lot, those words will often be trademarked. And people have often gone through the process of getting a registered trademark for that name. So you need to look out for that and be careful about it if you're using a name like that, especially. So I always caution everybody in the online entrepreneurship space, be careful about any preneur word. You've just got to be careful because it's probably there. Now, another thing you have to be careful about is if you're using lingo. And lingo, I don't want to make it seem like it's a horrible thing, but let me give you an example that'll bring it home to you. So the very first time I appeared as a guest on a podcast, I wasn't actively marketing myself. A guy came to me. He wanted me basically to create a podcast with him, and he was going to charge me way too much, but he offered to have me on a show that he had helped create and was in the process of launching with some other people. And he basically was this guy who was helping different people get shows launched. And so he said, hey, I'll get you on that. And so I did. And I went on the show, and I didn't even really know the name of the show until afterwards, because he said, well, we're just kind of creating it. And so I get on it, and I'm one of their first guests. I think it was like guest number 3 or 4. And then I said, okay, hey, what's the name of the show so I can go find it, when they told me it was live? And they said, it's called The Hashtag Show. Well, if you think about it, if you're in the social media space, hashtag is obviously part of the lingo. And so it's obviously a phrase that people are going to use frequently. So I go on to iTunes and I search it, and I discovered that there's not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different shows named The Hashtag Show. Now, 3 of them, or 2 of them, I think weren't being produced anymore, but one of them was, and then there was one I was on. And I looked at it and I said, oh, and I mean, I almost banged my head against the wall because you just can't do that. The person who was using the hashtag show first would have the exclusive rights to it under trademark law for a podcast. I mean, creating another podcast, you're pretty clearly going to cause some confusion there. Now, you might have some arguments, you might have some basic reasons not to, but you might have some real problems because, again, you could have this real consumer confusion where if I told people, hey, I was on the hashtag show, they might not know which one. They're not going to know who created that product or that service. So that's an example of lingo, but you can hopefully start to think through it. Whatever space you're in, you could definitely kind of see how there could be some, common phrases that are going to be used because they're part of the lingo. Well, if you're going to use that as your name without something else, you potentially have some problems and you're going to have to think about it and you're going to have to definitely do some really close checking to make sure it's not an issue. Now, the last area that I like to raise as a potential concern for people is puns. If you are going to use kind of a punny name of some sort, and there are other people who, are using puns as well, you potentially run into a problem. The place I like to give as an example, because it's really easy, I know it from my kind of personal life and something I enjoy, is the craft beer industry. Now, craft beer, I mean, traditionally beer is made from 4 or 5 ingredients: hops, barley, water, and yeast, and then some wheat and some other things added in. Well, so in the craft beer industry, in this craft beer explosion, there were a lot of puns based upon hops, and a lot of puns based upon wheat, and a lot of puns based upon yeast. And the problem is there's only so many puns that are out there. And so you ended up having a lot of trademark disputes in the craft beer industry because of that, because people were independently coming up with the same name based upon these puns. Well, if you're using puns and you're in an industry, again, where there aren't going to be a ton of different ways that you could use puns, well, you're going to have to think about it and you're going to have to look closely. So again, the area is a big concern that you need to think about is if you're taking a mashup of words like the preneur example, if you're using lingo, again, the hashtag show is an example, or if you're using puns, and the craft beer puns based on hops are the example there. Those are areas where you have to be very, very cognizant of this issue and very careful. Okay, so now we're going to get to the guidance, which is the third piece here. So what do you have to do? How do you make sure that you can legally use the name? Well, what you have to do is you have to run what's called a trademark search. And again, remember going back what I told you, that the concept is that if you're not first, you're last. So you need to make sure that no one else is using the name in a way that would prevent you from using it. So this you do by running a trademark search to see if anyone else has done that. And this is a critical piece. This is kind of the most important guidance here. And ideally, you would do this before you launch your brand. But if you haven't done it yet, and you already have a brand or a concept or a name out there, you should do it now and decide what, you're going to decide what to do after kind of you get the results of it and make that decision. The reason why you want to do it before you launch is because what I will tell people is almost always this. If you find a problem, even if it's not a clear problem, even if maybe you could use it, but it's not clear, you're almost always going to be better off choosing a different name. Because quite honestly, as a small online entrepreneur or an entrepreneur who's starting out, or even an entrepreneur who's, at pace making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, you can't afford a trademark dispute. I'm just going to be honest with you. A trademark dispute, to hire me or some other lawyer to help you handle it, is going to cost you high 5 figures into the 6 figures. And I don't know about you, but I don't have $50,000. I don't have $100,000 sitting around to defend a trademark suit. And so the problem is, if you get into a fight later, often you're simply going to have to back down then. And so you'd be much better served to, do this search at the beginning before you put anything into your brand name. Make sure you can use it. And if anything comes up that would be a problem, you simply say, I'm going to choose a different name. Because most times, as good as your name is, as awesome as that name you picked is, you could probably come up with another one that's just as good. if you did it in advance and if you haven't put anything in yet. So that's why I always like to tell people you want to do this as early as possible, because the problem comes if you've been in business for a year and a half and you run the search, then it gets more complicated and then you have to think about it. And we're going to talk about what you do kind of with the results after we talk about how you run the search, but it gets more complicated is the short answer. So let's talk first, before we talk about what you do with the results, with how do you run a search? Now, because we remember we talked about there are multiple ways you can get a trademark. Either you file to register it, or by just using it, you get rights. Because of that, there's not a single place you can go to check to see if someone has protection. There are, I like to say you need to do 3 different pieces to your trademark search. First, you have to check the registry. So you're going to check the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and you can search it yourself. Again, it's not that hard. You go to uspto.gov. That's the website. You're going to look for a tab that says trademark. And then there's a section in that tab that's Trademark Electronic Search System, I believe, tests. You're going to click through to there. And then all you got to do is basically, you're going to do a word search for your name and put the name in and see what happens. So that's the first place you're going to search. The second place you have to search is, or the second and third are both for the common law, for people who have not registered, but are they using it? So you're going to search Google, and then you're going to search somewhere to check social media and domain names. So those are the 3 places: the Patent and Trademark Office, Google, and then domain names and social media handles. Now, while I'm mentioning this domain name, I want to address this issue. A lot of people confuse the issue of trademark with domain name. They're not the same. The fact that a domain name is available does not mean that you could use the trademark. For example, it could be the case that you added a "the" to a phrase, and so the domain name is available, but someone is using the same phrase without "the." Well, you're not going to be able to use a trademark by adding "the" to the beginning of a word, for example. And it wouldn't make sense in this case, but you couldn't create a business that competed with mine and call it Your Online Genius. I mean, you couldn't do that. Again, it wouldn't make sense grammatically, but by adding "the" to the beginning of my name, you would not get away from it because people would likely be confused. So domain names are different. They can be an important sign, but they're not necessarily going to be an answer. So now we've talked about the 3 places you have to go. And again, if you want a resource where you can search domain names and social media all in one, I use a service called namebind.com. It's a free site you can check. Again, it's not perfect because if you have a long name, obviously some social media sites, the handle couldn't be. I think Your Online Genius, for example, is too long, so you would never be able to use that. When you do the search, though, in these 3 different places, you have to search a few things. You have to search the exact name you're using. So in my case, Your Online Genius. But you can't stop there because remember, even similar names could prevent you from using your name if they're likely to confuse the consumers. So there's a couple of things you need to think about here. Number one, if you have articles or things like that on it, you got to remove those. So if you were "the" something, take off the when you run the search because "the" doesn't matter. You also would have to think about things that are related. So in my case, for Your Online Genius, well, if someone had My Online Genius and they were in the same space, that could be a problem. If someone had Their Online Genius or anything like that. So a good practice would be think about, okay, well, I should maybe, in the case of my brand, just search Online Genius and see if Online Genius pops anything up. So you've got to broaden it to do those things. If there are obvious misspellings that people might do intentionally within changing an S to a Z, for example, or something like that, you have to check those as well. If there are ways where someone might, and I forget the name of these words, but words where it's, like there, and there, and words that are spelled differently but sound the same, you need to check those as well. Again, often those you'll be able to just kind of take those out of the name itself. But you need to search broadly for anything that would bring up anything related to your brand. Now, so you do that process. And so how do you do it? Well, you do it at the USPTO. You're going to get a set of results. They're going to say, are there any results? Yes or no. And then it'll show you if they're alive or dead. If it's a dead trademark, you generally aren't going to have to worry about it. If it's alive, you need to make a note. When you're doing this process, what you're going to do is make a note of anything you find. And then after you've done the whole process, you'll decide. So you do that on the USPTO website. Then on Google, you're not going to just search the first page. You want to go multiple pages deep until the results have absolutely positively nothing to do with what you're looking for. So, I don't know if that's 10 pages deep. You'll have a sense, but you go multiple pages deep, make sure nothing related is coming up. Anything related, mark it. And then again, Namevine is going to check the domain name and then your social media handles. You can do that individually if you want to, rather than using one of these services, but that's the concept. So once you've done that, let's talk about, there can be a couple of clear cases. One, let's say nothing similar comes up. You're golden. You can use the name. You have no problem. But you also might have something bad that's clear, which is, let's say that when I was searching for Your Online Genius, I had found a company called Your Online Genius in my exact same space. Well, then I can't use it. It's just that simple. And it doesn't matter if I found them on Google, if I found them anywhere else. If there was another company or person out there using that brand name to offer any kind of educational services about the law, then I wouldn't have been able to use it. It's just that simple. Those are the easy cases. And those are the cases that are easy even if you're later in your business. So I want to talk about that for a second. If you've been using the name for a couple of years or a year or however long, and you find one of those clear conflicts, someone has been using the brand longer than you in your same space, you're going to need to rebrand. And what you're going to want to try to do is do it now in an orderly fashion and come up with a name you like, and do it before the other person comes and says, hey, what are you doing using my name? Because that way you don't have to do it in crisis mode, and you can do it in an orderly fashion and do it just as a rebranding. So that's that case. The difficulty is, what do you do with, let's say you find a similar but not identical name? Or let's say you find an identical name, but it's not really the same area, but it's similar. So for example, let's say you create a product and someone uses the same name, not for that product, but for something similar, where people might think the same company is selling it, but it's not clear. The bad news is, at that point, if you want to keep using the name, you need to talk to a trademark lawyer to give you some advice. Now, if you do this before you have launched, or at a point where you could rebrand without too much difficulty, my guidance to you is come up with a different name. And the reason why is, normally it's not going to be worth your while to come pay me or some other lawyer thousands of dollars, when at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to give you a clear answer. At the end of the day, we're going to be able to tell you, well, here's what I think, but there are no guarantees. Just so you have a sense, if you go to an IP lawyer and ask for an opinion letter, they will give you their opinion, but there will be no guarantees. It will be caveated up the wazoo saying, hey, this is my best judgment, but I can't guarantee it. There's no way. I don't know, blah, blah, blah. So do you really want to pay me or some other lawyer thousands of dollars to give you that opinion? Or wouldn't you rather come up with a different name and use that name instead? So that's, if you've done it early, you can do it and you make that change. That's generally the guidance, because again, what you need to avoid is the dispute. You need to avoid the issue so that you don't have to worry about, finding yourself in an expensive dispute later. I understand that gets more complicated if, for example, you've been in business for 2 or 3 years and then you find something and then they've been using the name longer than you. What do you do then? If it's a clear case, you're going to probably need to rebrand. If it's not a clear case, that's when you might want to invest in talking with a lawyer to get their opinion about, can you use it or not? How big of a problem is it, etc. That's when you're going to want to get that sense. That's when making that investment of a few $1,000s will probably be worth your while. But before that, the easiest advice and guidance is generally going to be, just go ahead and choose a different name so you don't have to spend that money. So that's the general what you have to do and what you're going to do as a result. Now, I do want to talk about sequencing here, because this is an issue that trips people up. Once you find the name you want, run the search and determine that you are clear and can use this name, that's when you want to secure the domain name and secure related domain names. For example, if I was just using Online Genius, I might have wanted to also buy The Online Genius so that someone else couldn't have a website called The Online Genius. Again, This is about risk management because I don't want someone to start using a name and then me have to send them a letter and try to fight with them. I just want to avoid them from doing it in the first place. So that's when you're going to start doing that, is reserve everything once you've done it. Reserve the social media handles, reserve the domain names, etc. That way you've got it locked down and you can use it. You want to do it in that sequence. Run the search, make sure you can use the name, then secure everything. And then that takes us to the last piece, which is, should you then file to register a trademark for your name? And this is the piece. Again, what I want to say is, before you do that, make sure you lock down the domain name, because you don't want to go through the process of registering a mark only to find that someone has then taken the domain name and you're going to have to fight with them to get it back. So you just don't want to find yourself in those shoes. My general guidance to people is this: if it's your brand name, or if it is one of your signature courses or signature piece of your platform, like a podcast or something like that, should you trademark the name? Yes, you should, because it's not an overly expensive process to do. Like I said earlier, it costs you, I think, $225 is the current fee to the Patent and Trademark Office. And depending on where you want to go, if it's a simple thing, if you've done the search and there's not going to be a problem, you can get someone to file that application for you pretty cheaply. The company I use, I think they're currently charging $160 or $165 in addition to the fees. So for about $400, I can lock down the trademark, get nationwide protection for it, avoid a dispute. If anyone later tries to use it, I can say, hey, no, I've got to register a trademark. You can't do that. And so for your brand name, for your signature pieces of a platform, if they're different from your brand name, it's worth doing. Now, I wouldn't do it for slogans. I wouldn't, again, those are the kinds of things. If you start trademarking everything, it can get way too expensive. And you have to think about, am I going to continue to want to use this thing in the long term, is where you're going to want to think about it. But generally, the guidance that I give people is, for your brand name, if you have a signature part of your online platform that has a different name from your brand name, and then if you have a signature course or something like that, again, where the name is different from your brand name, those are the places that it will often be a good decision to go ahead and register your trademark. Once you get that registration in place, what's going to happen is you're going to be the exclusive person who can use it in your area of commerce. So for me, it would be in the area of providing, legal education to entrepreneurs or something similar. So if someone tried to use it in a very similar space, I could prevent them. And it's just going to make things much easier. So there's no question, no issues down the line. So that's the general guidance I give to people. But what I want you to understand is, registering a mark, that's the icing on the cake. The first piece, the more important piece, is to play defense first. Make sure that no one else has rights. And only after you've finished that process do you want to then go about filing to register your mark. Now, if you know for sure that you're going to want to register your mark, you're probably going to go to an attorney and they're going to run some search for you as well. And that's fine. But I just want you to make sure that you are going to do the first piece, the defense piece. That is where more entrepreneurs get tripped up than others. And again, the last thing you want is to get one of those dreaded cease and desist letters 6 months, a year after you've been putting a bunch into building your brand, and then have to back down and rebrand. So that's the important concept, and that's what you need to do. So that's it for this mini training. Again, recapping, when you think about naming, it's all about trademark law, which again, the standards always are consumers going to be confused about who is producing a good or service. So that's always going to be how you have to view these things. The big areas of concern are areas where there's likely to be, things get used where you shorten a name or where you mash things up or there's lingo or puns. What you have to do in every case, but it's going to be especially a problem in those other areas, is you need to run a trademark search, which is going to search the USPTO's database. It's going to search Google. It's going to search social media and domain names. Again, you can also pay someone to do that search for you. You can go to a place like a LegalZoom if you wanted to, but you're better off going to a trademark attorney because they'll actually normally give you an opinion. But those searches will cost you $500-$600 often if you want to get a more detailed results. But once you've done that search, you decide, can you use it? Yes or no. And then from there, you decide whether you want to register it. That's the process in a nutshell for naming your business and making sure you've got all of your legal ducks in a row. Until next time, this is Bobby Klinck. Again, if you're enjoying these training series, I would love for you to join me on one of my weekly webinars called Legal Made Simple, where I kind of walk through all of the different areas. I give some detail. You'll be able to see my screen so you can actually see some samples of things and some examples. And I kind of walk through this process. For example, with the trademark, I literally walk you through the different screens you're going to see to do a search on the internet, at least in the current version of the webinar. That's what I'm doing. I'll walk you through the process of doing a search on the USPTO's database. So you get a sense, you're going to get some real value out of the webinar. I'd love for you to join me on it. If you want to, you go to youronlinegenius.com/webinar. You can sign up for whatever the next webinar is, and I look forward to seeing you there. But again, until next time, this is Bobby Klinck. I hope you have a great week.
Thanks for listening. And remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.